Hello, everyone. My name is Sister Estelle, and on behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to this conversation with Father Jeremiah Shryock and John Sweeney on this Franciscan Friday. We are so grateful to be able to gather with all of you during this time of separation. A recording of today's presentation will be available later to share with anyone who couldn't join us, and we'll also let you know how you can get a copy of Father Jeremiah's book, Amid Passing Things, as well as some of our other Franciscan spirituality titles. We had such a great response to our conversation last week with Father Jeremiah and John that we thought we'd continue this week with What Franciscans Do and Why. Father Jeremiah will be sharing about his new book, Amid Passing Things, which is out now. It's great. There will be a time for questions at the end of this hour, so please do use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post any questions, and we'll get to those. And I'll also be posting various links in the chat bar if you'd like to keep that open, and you can locate both of those buttons at the bottom of your screen. Just to let you know a little bit about our panelists today, Father Jeremiah Shryock is a Franciscan Friar of the Renewal. He entered the Franciscan Friars in 2002, and he lives at the House of Prayer in Monticello, New York, where his primary ministries are prayer, spiritual direction, preaching parish missions, and facilitating retreats. His new book, Amid Passing Things, is a collection of meditations on the ways God enters our lives, even when we're unaware. Based on his own life experiences, Father Jeremiah offers both struggles and joys that come in a life that's consciously entering and encountering God, the Holy One, all around us, not in some far off place, but right here and now in this life amid passing things. John Sweeney is Paraclete's publisher. He's also the author of over 30 books, including the St. Francis Prayer Book, The Complete Francis of Assisi, Lord, Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace, and When St. Francis Saved the Church, which was the winner of a 2015 award in history from the Catholic Press Association, and a charming fiction series for children, The Pope's Cat. He is on the board of the Association of Catholic Publishers and lives in Milwaukee with his wife and daughters. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, both Father Jeremiah and John.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you.
Nice to be here. We need to get talking so that I warm up. I'm in Milwaukee, as you said, and sitting outside, and I think it's 38 degrees right now, but inside I have a wife who's always on the phone, 2 children who I wish were at school, a dog, 2 kittens, and a goldfish. And sometimes a next door neighbor who comes and visits my 8-year-old, and they run all over the place. And so it's easier to be out here in the cold than it is to say, be quiet, be quiet. So anyway, that's where I am. Father Jeremiah, where are you?
I am in Monticello, New York, which is about 2 hours north of New York City.
And are you, you live in community, so you're used to living closely with people also, but are you starting to get a little like wanting to tell others to go for a long walk?
Yeah, that's right. It hasn't gotten that bad yet. You know, part of the advantage is we do have 60 acres up here. We kind of live in the woods. So it is our retreat center. So let's just put it this way. I've been going on extended walks over the past couple of weeks. So.
And unlike my son who lives in Manhattan, not too far from you, you don't have to wear a mask when you go for a walk.
Correct. I don't. There's no one around except deer and a couple bears.
Well, so last week, as Sister Estelle said, last week, we had a good time talking about what do Franciscans do and why. And a lot of that, of course, was what do you do and why. And you telling some stories that are stories that you tell sometimes in amid passing things. And I wanted to sort of pick back up there, but you know, we'll move off of you at some point. But I wanted to start there anyway. I know that a lot of people are curious as to how and why people make decisions to enter religious life. I'm sure you get questions like this all the time, going back to when you were 19 or whatever, and you were making those decisions for the first time. But For instance, one thing that I know people often wonder is, you take vows, of course. So you have a vow of obedience. Were you a naturally obedient person before you decided to take a vow of obedience?
Yeah, I don't think anyone is naturally given human nature. I think, some people might be more inclined to it than others. I think obedience, like all the vows, we always say that these vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, they're not natural, they're supernatural, right? And so it takes a grace, obviously, to live them and to see them not just as, like we always say that in the vow of obedience, it comes from the Latin word, which means to hear, right? Or to listen. So we're hearing the voice of God through the humanity of a superior or someone who's in charge of us. And that's a lifelong lesson to learn, right? Because oftentimes we stop at the humanity, whether it's our own or our superior or the person in charge. But we try to see it as actually the voice of God speaking to us through, an imperfect instrument.
And how do you think or see that the person who's not under a vow of obedience still, the Christian, still can and does live in obedience? How does that work? I mean, for you, it's a structured way, really, of living in obedience. I mean, how about for others? How do you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, depending on a person's vocation, right? I mean, every person, regardless of the vocation, owes obedience to obviously to God and to the church and to those who are over them in terms of maybe even ministry. So we're always, maybe to put it this way, we're always listening for God's voice coming through different ways, whether that's the church or whether that's our own individual particular vocations. And even sometimes even in the privacy of our own prayer, like, are we really listening for God's voice coming to us?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because it was my intention to come back to the subject of listening. We're going to do that. So last week, you and I talked about desire, and we talked about longing, and I want to get to some other topics like that. But for a minute, I want to stay on your vocation, because like I did last week, I jotted down a few quotes from your book. So you have to own up to these quotes.
Oh, no.
In chapter 5, which is called A Vocation Story, you write this. I'm reading from the book.
Okay.
Currently, I am living a more contemplative expression of Franciscan life, one that includes large periods of silence and solitude. The reason is not because I want to avoid people, but because I am falling more deeply in love with the silent presence of God, who is continuing to invite me, even in this desire, to still something more. So what is the silent presence of God? What does it sound like?
It's a great question. It's it's hard to describe. It's unlike anything else. It's more of not so much of a sound maybe, but as a movement in one's own heart. Maybe just to back up a little bit. So where I live in our house of prayer here, this life that I'm living up here is quite different than the normal Franciscan life of my community. So the way that looks practically is I get to spend about maybe 5 to 7 days every month in our hermitage here that we have built on our property. So it's just basically a little cabin that we've built. And so I get to spend about 5 to 7 days every month in a hermitage alone, in solitude and silence. The average friar would spend about 1 or 2 days alone. And because we're up here in the city, my apostolate is not so active. So just the environment is more naturally conducive to silence, to things like prayer, and things like solitude. And like I even said in my book, before I was a Franciscan, I was seriously discerning with the Trappists, the Cistercians, which is a contemplative cloistered community. So I always had this contemplative drawing, but I never felt called to a fully contemplative life. I still felt called to have some sort of ministry, particularly with the poor and preaching. However, as I'm growing older, especially my vocation, this contemplative urge is sort of drawing me deeper. And I think just the way that looks like is just in my own heart, there's just a greater desire to be alone with God in silence and in solitude. And I feel like I'm meeting him in a much more different, profound way in that silence and in that solitude. It's something that's hard to articulate, but I think maybe one way of understanding it is the way of when you're in love, there's this desire and there's this love that increases that can't always be articulated, but you know it's happening in the very depths of your heart. And I think that's similar maybe to what's happening with me and the Lord.
One of the things that I really enjoy about the life of Francis of Assisi is how you watch him as a young person, as a teenager, as a young man, move from someone who loved parties and lots of friends and always had money in his pocket and adventure, and then comes to a point where that conversion starts to really percolate, and all of a sudden he wants to be alone. All of a sudden he's hungering for times alone. And it seems to me that the profundity of his conversion, you know, the stories that then come very soon after that point in his life were made possible by him being able to quiet himself down. Did you go through anything like that? Do you think everyone has to go through something like that?
I think yes. I think to some degree. You know, Saint John of the Cross says that silence is God's first language, right? And so silence is not just something that's reserved to friars or to monks or to nuns. Every one of us, to some degree, needs to have a little bit of silence in our lives. And I think what we discover in the silence, there's this sort of a first experience of silence is that it's almost like scary. We see ourselves and we see our fears, we see maybe our anxieties, and we run away from it. I mean, our culture, we do it all the time. We run away from silence. But the more we can stay there with the Lord, it's almost like the Lord takes us to a deeper place where we realize maybe those initial things we were afraid of, feelings, emotions, memories, but there's something much more deeper than that. And we encounter the Lord's presence in that, if we can stay in that silence for a little bit of time, you know. And again, it's going to look different for everybody, every person's life, but silence, in my opinion, is a fundamental aspect of the Christian life. Without silence, one cannot grow in their relationship with God or with prayer.
Now, I don't want to get too mystical here.
Okay.
You and I have talked about that. We don't want to get too mystical or get into theology too much, but I want to just take one step further because based on something you just said, because it's so true, of course, for all of us that we avoid silence. You know, I watch it in myself. I watch it in others. When we have sort of a downtime, when we have a period in between responsibilities, more than ever, people today, I mean, more than 5 years ago, more than 20 years ago, we fill that vacuum, that void with entertainment. We look at our phones, you know, we check if anybody's liked our Facebook post, you know, we watch video constantly. So anyway, that's not theological. The theological question is this, which is that void, that vacuum that we're experiencing right there. What does God do with that? What happens if we always fill that void in that vacuum? A, and B, what does God do? What does God want to do with that void, that vacuum?
Yeah. I think to your first question, if we continue to fill it, like you said, the answer is we'll be continually restless, we'll be continually unhappy, and we'll be more prone to things like anxiety and fear. Simply because those things that you mentioned, obviously in and of themselves, they're not bad, right? You know, social media it's good. It's not a bad thing, of course. But our problem is when we can't remove ourselves from it. When these things, whether it's social media, entertainment, or anything, when they take possession of us. And the danger with that is we'll always remain on the surface then, because in this desire, God is whispering in some ways. He's whispering to us, calling us by name to a deeper encounter with him in silence. If we could only just get in the boat, and maybe the way that looks like practically is detach ourselves a little bit from our go-tos, whether it's social media or entertainment, for a little bit of time, and take that time and just to spend with the Lord and simply to say, here I am.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Now I'm going to turn to your book.
Okay.
One thing that I really like about Amid Passing Things is that a number of the chapters begin with a sort of zinger of a sentence, you know. And of course, that's good writing. I mean, you immediately get the attention of the reader with the beginning of the chapter. So, chapter 31 is titled Becoming Present. And chapter 31 begins with this. My years as a priest, spiritual director, and confessor have confirmed for me an important fact about humanity. We spend little time in reality. Now, I love that. And of course, I sort of think I know what that means, but tell me what that means.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this includes myself as well. You know, it's amazing how much time we spend each day in things like our daydreams, memories, the way we think someone else should be, or the way we think we should be, the way we think life should be, our boss should be, constantly entertaining ideas about the past, the present, the future. Meanwhile, the present moment, God is right in front of us as things really are. And we oftentimes just can't be there because we're always somewhere else in these different daydreams or fantasies.
So how do you stay there?
Yeah, great question. I think, well, one way is, since we're talking about prayer, is continually coming back to the Lord in those distractions and saying, you know, Lord, here I am. I think it was, I could be wrong, but Simone Weil, I think, described prayer as learning to pay attention to God, right? And, you know, there's as many different ways as there are to prayer. There's many different ways to do that. But I think once we begin to realize, you know, I'm daydreaming here, or I'm thinking about something that happened yesterday, or even I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, it's always an opportunity to come back and say, you know, Lord, here I am. I want to spend this time with you, you know.
Yeah.
Very much like you would say to someone who, you know, maybe if you're with your wife or with someone else you love and you notice yourself distracted, you simply return your attention and say, you know, honey, here I am. Sorry, I'm distracted again. Right?
I mean, how that happens all the time, of course. You know, I mean, someone's talking and I realize that a minute or two have gone by and I really haven't been paying any attention, but I'm looking at you, you know,
Right.
but I'm not listening to you.
Yeah.
And I suppose we do that with God all the time.
Absolutely. You know, if you spend, like, let's say you have 30 minutes of prayer, if you spend 2 minutes of that 30 minutes really attentive to God's presence, that's a huge grace. That's a huge accomplishment. People sometimes think that good prayer means never being distracted. That's not what good prayer is. Good prayer means returning to God again and again and again, whether I'm distracted or not.
So in your own life, as a friar, do you have set aside times when you don't do certain things? I mean, I know you have set aside times for prayer, set aside times for liturgy, set aside times for manual work, perhaps, things like that. But do you have set aside times when you just say, well, from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m., I'm not going to do this? Or, I mean, do you have any of that kind of, or on Sundays, I don't do this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have, I guess, what we could call free time, you know. There's times throughout the day where like there's just silence, and so there'll be no like physical work going on in the house. For sure. I mean, in that free time, you know, I mean, there's time to do things like exercise, you know, or to go for a walk or something like that. So yeah, for sure.
Which reminds me of something else in your book. I actually didn't jot this down to ask you about it, but I remember you have a chapter where you talk about coming back from a retreat, and how, you know, you always feel odd, unsettled coming back from a retreat. And when I first read that chapter, I was, you know, putting exclamation points in the margin because I and so many people probably who are listening have that experience. I mean, you know, you go off to a retreat, for instance, we talked last week about the Cistercians, and every year I take a retreat at a Trappist monastery, and I love that the meals have no talking. But sometimes I wonder, do I love that the meals have no talking because I've gotten so tired of my wife and children talking all the time during dinner? Or is it because I'm actually talking with God? I'm not so sure. But then when I come back from the retreat, all that quiet, all that beauty, all that simplicity, of course, is just gone in an instant when I walk back in the door. So, I mean, how do you maintain equilibrium between you, I mean, personally, between walking alone in the 60 acres and seeing a black bear and coming back with your fellow friars, and there's one of the guys there who does something that always annoys you or whatever? I mean, how do you keep that equilibrium? How do you keep yourself in a place where you ought to be with yourself and with God?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, myself, certainly I don't do this perfectly, but I think one of the ways I'm realizing, I think we talked a little bit about this last time, is that what we talk about the integration, right, of our life. So the more time we spend with God, particularly in prayer and in silence, the more, if we're really meeting God, that's going to spill over, right, into our normal life. And again, not that we're going to be perfect, of course not, but I always tell people on a retreat, the best thing you can do for your spouse is to devote time to pray each day, whether it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And the reason why I say that is because if a person is praying, generally praying, seeking God to the best of their ability, it's going to affect your relationships. You're going to realize you're going to become, over time, usually not overnight, but over time, again, the fruits of the Spirit: more patient, more forgiving, more loving, more accepting, right? The more we encounter God's love for us personally, at least the greater opportunity there is for us to accept the other person as God is accepting us, right? Again, we're never perfect in this area, right? But I think this is why developing a prayer life is so important, because it eventually, we start off, okay, this is me and Jesus time, everyone else get out, right? But as we grow in that, it includes in our whole life, right? It includes the people we meet. It will bleed over into our work and things like that. Just the way, the way a family begins, right? You meet your wife, right? Now, you were just describing, you got a whole house full of kids and animals and all kinds of people. So the love between you and your wife started with just the both of you, and now it's including all these other people. I think the same thing is true in our relationship with God, right? It starts him and I, and that's important. We need that. But then it eventually, hopefully with time, it affects the rest of our life. I always say with people sometimes in spiritual direction who are discouraged, they'll be like, well, I'm experiencing the same struggles, or I'm constantly distracted, or anything like this. But then they'll share something like maybe a moment when they realized they were more patient than they used to be a year ago, or they're able to forgive someone who 3 months ago would be impossible. I'm always like, right there, there's the grace of God. Like, your prayer is working, right? Because you're slowly transforming, you're slowly changing. Most of us don't have St. Paul conversions where it's like, boom, it's a lifelong process. So.
Well, all right, now let me give you another chapter.
Okay.
So chapter 32, and this is the one I said I was going to come back to. So chapter 32 is titled Listening, and it begins with this. The only way I can have a conversation with my nephews, ages 12 and 18, is if I take away their phones. Now, surely there's no one listening to us today who can't relate to that.
Sure.
I mean, unless they live in a community that does not have mobile phones. So what about these distractions? How do you think we manage them? If you're dealing with kids and you can just take them away, which I do with my kids every day, frequently, all the time, and according to a schedule, but those of us who are adults don't usually impose a schedule on ourselves, maybe in the way that we ought to. But how do you deal with distractions, whether you're a friar or whether you're living a different sort of a life somewhere else?
Yeah, I think first to realize again, distractions are a very, very normal part of life. I get distracted all the time, right? But I think it's a matter of we don't want to allow ourselves to become distracted by our distractions. And what I mean by that is, okay, we're distracted, okay? And then all of a sudden, we're somewhere else distracted by those distractions. Especially like, again, if we're talking about in the context of prayer, it's like, can I just bring myself back to God over and over and over and over again? Or am I going to follow this road of distraction, which is generally coupled in some sort of fear, right, about the future or some sort of hurt from the past. In that opportunity, we're given the chance to really bring that here to God and say, Lord, I'm afraid about the future and I'm distracted by it. And here I am with my fear about whatever it might be or my hurt from the past. So I think in that context, then nothing really is a distraction, but everything becomes a bridge or a way for us to meet God more deeply, as long as we're bringing it, whatever it is, to God. That makes sense.
No, it does. It does make sense. It also makes me wonder about how do personality traits relate to prayer? Is that something that you deal with in spiritual direction with people? I mean, for instance, if I feel called to a more solitude or a more contemplative prayer life that is alone as opposed to with others, is it because I just, I'm not a very agreeable person? I mean, is it maybe because I'm not doing a good job at loving others, or does it come from a genuine place? Or if I love to be with other people and so my spiritual gift is hospitality, well, is that always good for me in my relationship with other people and with God, or does sometimes that get in the way? How do you deal with, understanding your personality type and your traits and how that needs to relate to your spiritual life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when we're talking about things like personality or temperaments, clearly God has given those to us, right? And there's many ways in which they become gifts. However, one thing we have to realize is that God oftentimes takes us beyond our personality, beyond our temperament. I think sometimes we can use personality and temperament to hide. So for example, like we could say, I'm an introvert, right? And if you're familiar with temperaments, I'm a melancholic phlegmatic, my temperament. And so naturally I could say, oh, well, I'm not going to give this talk to, 3,000 people because I'm an introvert. I can't do that, right? But oftentimes God could be stretching me to say, you're also more than your temperament. You're more than your personality. Yeah, I made you an introvert, but I'm not in some ways boxing you in, making you stay there. I might call you out to speak to 3,000 people or to be very active. But then I'll call you back to where naturally you are more grounded. So there's ways in which, it's interesting because I know I have a few friends who are monks, who are, cloistered, and every one of them that I'm friends with is an extrovert. And you wouldn't think that, but they often tell me, like, they will say, I need the opposite to balance me out, And I've also noticed it too. It's interesting with married couples, at least the ones I've married as a priest. The spouses generally are the opposite of the other, whether it's in temperament or personality, because we need the other to balance us out,
Yes.
Because by ourselves, we're incomplete, And so that's one of the things even my community does for me. So if I didn't have my community, I'd probably just disappear into the woods for like 6 months and, grow long hair and a long beard. But I have to come back to my community and they sort of pull me back to reality and draw me out of myself. And so it's a balance, right? We take what God has given to us, but we also have to be willing to be stretched because God doesn't just limit us there. He takes us sometimes where we don't want to go naturally.
Well, and as you probably know, what you just said is really good marriage counseling. And
You can pay me
by the
later.
way-
Send me a check.
and by the way, I have the same experience with contemplative monks.
Yeah.
You know, you go on retreat and then you set aside a time to go, you know, sit in one of the sort of counseling rooms, and he won't stop talking.
You're the first person he's talked to in like a month.
Yeah, right. All right, so I have one more chapter on. So you lead off chapter 7 of Amid Passing Things, which is the chapter is called Not Enough, by saying, I have this insatiable thirst for God. So my question is a really easy one, which is, how can I get that?
Well, I think, John, you already have it. And I think everyone has it. I think some people might just be more aware of it than others. But the desire for God, the thirst for God is written in the human heart. Right. And I think we see that in every person. You know, I oftentimes like to say, what is every athlete ultimately looking for, even in their sport, right? Or what is every person who's desiring love ultimately looking for? Or what is every writer looking for in their art? It's God, right? And what I mean by God is I'm talking about that reality that is loving, that is all-knowing, that is unconditional love, that satisfies the human heart. I mean, this is what each one of us is looking for. You know, again, I think we quoted St. Augustine last time, right? When St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so I think everyone has this desire, but I think some people will either push it aside or try to substitute it for other things, you know, whether it's one's own career, or they make maybe money the pursuit of their life, or how they look, or their health. We turn those little things into gods as opposed to the living God.
I also have in my hands here a copy of the writings of St. Francis. And I opened up his testament this morning because I wanted to find a couple of examples of things that friars do so that we can be really practical here. So, and by the way, to those who are listening, if they've never read the actual writings of Francis of Assisi, you should. And, you know, there's a rule, and there's the Canticle of the Creatures, and there's a couple of letters and things like that. But at the end of his life, he wrote his spiritual testament, and it's a beautiful piece of writing, and it summarizes his life autobiographically. But anyway, he says, I'm just going to give you a quote, and then I'm going to read you a quote from St. Francis, and you tell me how this relates to your Franciscan life, okay? I worked with my hands, and I still desire to do so. I desperately want every one of my brothers to work at some honest job.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, work is a good thing, right? Why? Because first of all, it takes us out of our mind, and oftentimes it can root us in reality. And so God asks us all to work, right? And for each one of us, it's going to look different. It's in some ways, work is our way of contributing, right? Not only to society, but to God's work. You know, God is so humble. He oftentimes uses us to help bring about his glory, whether that's as an artist, whether that's as a teacher, whether that's as a mother, or whether that's as a writer, whatever it is, whatever work God has given to you has incredible dignity, right? Jesus worked for 30 years. He spent the majority of his life as a carpenter, right? And that there's a tremendous dignity to work. Yeah.
Here's another one. In fact, it's the next paragraph. The brothers should always be careful not to accept any churches, dwellings, or anything else constructed for them unless those buildings reflect the holy poverty that we have promised to live by in the rule. We should always live in such places as strangers and pilgrims.
So the way that looks for us is when we get an assignment as a friar, we never know how long we're going to be somewhere. I've been assigned to a friary for a year. I've been assigned to a friary for 5 years. Actually, where I'm living right now, I've been here for 5 years, so it's kind of one of my longest assignments. And there is a real poverty in not knowing how long am I going to be here, right? And so one of the things we always guard against as Franciscans is we have this phrase is we don't want to build our nest anywhere, meaning we don't want to become so comfortable with a place that we kind of just settle like, okay, I'm just going to stay here for the rest of my life, right? I think human nature naturally desires that, a place to call home. But as Franciscans, we know there is no home in this earth. Like, we're always pilgrims. Francis was a pilgrim, and he wanted us, his followers, his brothers, to be reminded of this fact that we are pilgrims, and while we're here in this world, we're merely on pilgrimage. And so that's why poverty was so huge for him, and not wanting to become too comfortable with the things of this world. Why? Because they're bad? No, but because they can distract us from our real vocation and why we're really here.
Well, why did he have such difficulty getting those around him, those in authority in the church around him, and even his fellow friars, to keep living by that kind of strict poverty? Why was that? What does that say about, human nature, I guess, that was such a struggle? I mean, people may not know that, but it was such a struggle for him.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think Francis was an extraordinary human being, right? Most of us, to the degree of poverty, and even to just the degree he lived his life, we would look at Francis and we would say he's crazy, he's a fanatic. Even when Francis had his conversion, as he walked through town, his old friends would say he's lost his mind. He's completely gone crazy, because he really wanted to embrace the gospel. And I don't mean like he didn't want to just think about it, he didn't want to just talk about it, but he really wanted to live it. Now, obviously, there were some things that Francis did that we wouldn't encourage other people to do, right? Like the whole, when he strips naked in front of the town square, we don't want to necessarily encourage that behavior, but behind that crazy behavior, what you see is a heart that just wants to love God, that is utterly sincere, that is utterly pure. And I think when God saw some of this radical action of Francis, he couldn't help but smile and be moved, because he knew the heart of Francis that was doing some of these crazy things.
Yeah, it's when you said, he wanted to just live the gospel, I was kind of smiling to myself, because I was thinking, we say the gospel and the good news, we meaning just Christians generally, we say those phrases so easily now. Yeah. In a way that I don't think that's the way he said them or understood them. I mean, when you say he wanted to live the gospel, I mean, what it almost means is like he got out the gospels and the life of Jesus and almost was like underlining things and saying, okay, I'm going to do that too. I mean, specifically, it was not sort of generalized or homogenized in any way.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Francis said in the rule, quite simply, this is the rule of the Friars Minor, to observe the Holy Gospel. Like, that was all Francis wanted to do. And that confused everyone. Everyone's like, wait, you can't do that? Like, this needs to be structured, this needs to be organized. But Francis, he didn't want to live like that. And the reality is most people could not. Like, the Franciscan life needed some kind of organization. But Francis was a different person. He was given a tremendous amount of grace, and he was just extraordinary in that regard. St. Clare had the same battle. She fought for poverty. Yeah,
it was only at the end of her life she was able to sort of get what she had fought for.
Yeah. And everyone said to her, you're crazy, you got to lighten up a little bit, loosen up. But she knew this is what the Lord was asking of her.
Yeah.
So,
well, I should turn to Sister Estelle to see, there are probably a few questions from others, and we have 19 minutes left. So, okay. Sister Estelle, do you want to come in and give us a couple of questions from people who are watching?
You bet. Great. Thanks so much. So this is a question from Mary Denise Curran. Could you give us any tips to sustaining the silence you describe as God's first language? Is there a way to respond to God in this first language? My silence meeting the silence of God.
Great question, Mary Denise. And maybe I would just offer something that I oftentimes teach, and that is what is referred to as the prayer of the heart. In the Eastern Church, generally that's synonymous with the Jesus prayer, right? Of just having some sort of prayer, very short prayer that we sort of keep as a sort of anchor. So when we're spending time or trying to spend time with the Lord in silence, when we find ourselves, becoming distracted, which might be every 5 seconds, to have this short prayer to keep coming back to as a way to anchor us and to lead us through the distractions. So again, like I said, in the Eastern Church, it's typically referred to as the Jesus prayer, right? Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. But it could be also something much more simple, like the name of Jesus, right? Or different invocations that are in the scriptures, like come Lord Jesus, or Abba Father, or some sort of anchor. Because without that anchor, we get blown away with our distractions, with our thoughts. And so I've often felt, for me personally, that's a great way to help when we feel called, when we feel drawn to spend time with the Lord in silence. But also, we're also human. We have distractions, we have worries. And so this is a very practical way to help anchor us back towards silence.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
This is a question from Sally. Staying with prayer can be tough compared to immediate rewards and satisfaction of almost everything that's easier, appealing. It's just hard to connect with and again to God every day. Any advice?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sally. You're right, prayer is hard. I find prayer hard, and I've been praying for a long time. But that which is immediate that you mentioned, it doesn't satisfy, does it? I mean, it offers a temporary happiness, but everything that's worthy of love demands a little bit of time and even a little bit of struggle, right? And the same is true in prayer. God sees our struggle, and all he's really asking of us, seems to me, in prayer, is to persevere and to trust. Whether that's 5 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day, to say, okay, Lord, I'm giving you 15 minutes, and to stay there in that 15 minutes and realize you're not missing anything if you leave. I think it's in that perseverance where the heart opens and we begin to realize the emptiness of everything else that we've been using to try to fulfill or fill that hole that only God could fill. So yes, prayer is difficult, but if we stick with it, like anything, something opens up in us and we meet God in a deeper way. So don't quit.
What is the most common question that you hear from people in spiritual direction?
I think one of the most common questions I hear, not necessarily in spiritual direction, but if I'm out and about, is I prayed to God and he didn't answer my prayer. So what's God's problem? It's basically the question. And it's a great question. And I always answer that by saying, okay, God didn't answer your prayer, but what did he say to you? Are you listening to God, or is this simply a one-way relationship? I want what I want, forget about what God wants. Because oftentimes, let's just be honest, and me included, I don't really know what I need or what I really want. Only God does, right? Yes, we are invited to bring our intentions, our petitions, our desires to God, but we also should trust that God ultimately gives us what is best, right? St. Paul says, God works good for all of those who love him. God's good and our good, unfortunately, are not always equal. We think, I need this, or I want this. This will make me better, happier, healthier, holier. And oftentimes the Lord's like, actually, that wouldn't be good for you. I'm going to give you this, which is better. So.
I started out this by asking you about your sort of personal inclination to your vocation and, were you naturally obedient and that sort of thing. I suspect that another thing that people often wonder about people in religious life, ever since those revelations of Mother Teresa and the dark night that she went through for decades, is, does everyone in religious life go through that? I mean, do you go through periods of time, weeks, months, years, where you don't feel the love of God in any way? You don't know if God is there, but you just keep doing what you do?
Yeah. Well, John, that'll be my next book. It's too long to say. No, but I mean, I think, it's interesting. Darkness, the way you're referring to with Mother Teresa, which is a reference obviously to St. John the Cross, is a natural part of any disciple, anyone who's taking the Lord seriously. Darkness is a natural development. And I would say this, it's one of the greatest acts of God's mercy he can give us. Now, what I mean by darkness is the felt absence of God, right? So obviously God never disappears. It's impossible for God to disappear. But sometimes God removes us feeling his presence. And why does he do that? We always say it's because he's punishing me. I did something wrong or something happened to me. But the saints will tell us, particularly Mother Teresa and John the Cross, that God is inviting us through this darkness to actually grow up. It's in darkness where faith matures, love matures, hope matures. I mean, to be honest with you, I spend most of my life like this. I mean, I rarely ever experience anymore on a sense level God's presence or God's love. Like I said in the last recording, I have no idea what I'm doing 99.8% of the day, right? I have no idea what I'm doing, how I'm going to do it. But we're walking by faith here, and we're walking by trust. And I've lived long enough not knowing what I'm doing to have confidence and hope that God does. And despite my own poverty and inadequacy, he's working through this frail, broken instrument, right? So it's very normal to experience darkness. If you're taking God seriously, it's bound to happen. And it's a tremendous grace, tremendous.
But by the way, you of course know this, that there's a 14th century Franciscan classic called The Conformity by a friar named Bartholomew of Pisa. And there's a new edition of that out. So I've actually been reading it in the mornings lately. And just this morning, I was thinking about that issue that I just asked you about. And I came across a portion in that text where it talks about Francis going through this too, which I had not encountered before. And it says that in unspecified time, when he was fighting a temptation, he was doing penance. And as you mentioned when we were together last week, he sometimes did his penance a little too seriously and ended up, asking forgiveness of Brother Ass, his body, at the end of his life. And the text says that he lost the spiritual consolation. That's the phrase. The consolation of God for a period of time. Doesn't say how long, doesn't say what the temptation was, but the implication is that he was fighting temptation with penance, went overboard, and as a result somehow lost the consolation of God. So it even happened to Francis of Assisi.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And, like you mentioned Mother Teresa spent 40 years like that.
I know.
From the moment she heard the call to start this new community, the lights went out after that. And look at how extraordinary her life was. And that was all in darkness. And I would say God had to turn off the lights to do this work in her. Otherwise, there would still be a lot of her involved. And the same is true with us. Like, God has to purify us. And he does this because he loves us. But we just don't understand this. We experience it and we feel like I'm being punished. Everyone hates me. God hates me. It's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite. And obviously, it's a very delicate topic, but this seems to be the way with everyone who's taking the Lord seriously.
So we'll have to spend some other time talking about hope.
Yeah.
Now, this is all about hope, right? I mean, it's kind of the lost virtue, probably.
Right.
Sister Estelle, do you have maybe one more question? Do we have one more question?
We actually have three more questions.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we have time, John. I think we might. This one is from Dorothy Renner. My background is Benedictine, and I hear so many common aspects of spiritual life. How wonderful to share the spiritual path. One variation, though, is stability of place, which is a Benedictine vow. Can you see value in both stability and not ever putting down roots?
Absolutely. I always say, it's funny you mention that, because I always say to Benedictines, you take a vow of stability and we as Franciscans take a vow of instability. You know, obviously both are good, both are legitimate. It's which one is God calling you to? So remember Francis, when he first started, everyone said, look, you either have to become a Benedictine or a diocesan priest, right? Benedictines have a vow of stability, but Francis is like, that wasn't what God was calling me to. You know, he was calling him to a unstable life, right? To not be just settled down in one place. So I think for different people, God certainly calls them to that vocation, to that charism, and others, like myself, he calls us to be unstable.
That's a good answer. This question is from Elizabeth Tumbas. I'd like to go back to John's comment in the first session. It's hard to be a Franciscan with a mortgage. I'd be interested in hearing more from both of you on this for those of us living in the world.
Well, I liked Father Jeremiah's answer last week. I didn't really give an answer. I just posed the problem as something that I've struggled with for 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just say when I was first married, I resisted buying a home. I refused to have a mortgage because I was trying to still be Franciscan, even though I had already done things that didn't feel very Franciscan. But that was kind of a line I didn't want to cross, but I ended up crossing the line a long time ago. And I do soak the beans that I'm going to cook tomorrow.
So do I, John. It's okay. The friars I live with would kill me if I didn't.
I do purchase things today that I might use tomorrow also. And I do purchase things too. Francis would be invited to someone's house for dinner, and they would put out the sumptuous feast because the great Francis of Assisi was coming to dinner, and he'd be out at the road, with his begging bowl, making them all furious. So I don't know. I sort of reassure myself occasionally that Francis was such an extraordinary, unique person, and I'm not supposed to try and be Francis.
Right.
I'm supposed to try and do the best I can, and sometimes I think I'm doing okay, even though I have a mortgage. But Father Jeremiah, why don't you answer?
I think what we should be most concerned about here is the spirit of Francis, right? We can't live. Obviously, if you're married, you have a mortgage, like you just cannot live the way Francis lived. Even as a Franciscan, I don't live the way Francis lived. I have shoes, right? Francis didn't have shoes. I think we certainly want to be inspired by him, by his zeal. We don't want to water anything down. But at the same time, we don't want to get lost in the details of how he lived his life. But it's the spirit of Francis that is so captivating and so charming. So what does that look like for you as a mother, someone who owns a home? What does that look like for me as a Franciscan? Or what does that look like for somebody else? Because it's going to look different for each one of us, right? God is not asking me to be another Saint Francis of Assisi. He's asking me to be Father Jeremiah of Monticello, right? Just like he's asking John to be John Sweeney in Milwaukee. So it's going to look very different, right? But the spirit of Francis, if the Franciscan way is our way, is going to take root in us. And it's that we have to let that sort of grow within us, not necessarily living out the exact details of what he lived. Because God's not asking that of you, particularly as a married person.
Great. And then I think we have time for one last question. So this is from an anonymous attendee. So I have not been feeling God's love or presence for a long time, but I know it's there. In some ways, I feel closer to him now than before, like his love is in the darkness, the yearning. Is that crazy?
No, that's right on. That's wonderful. Because why do I say that? That yearning and that desire, its foundation is God, right? Feelings and thoughts and even experiences come and go, right? But that yearning and that desire is is stable ground. It's God's presence in you, and it doesn't change. Everything else is passing, as we say in amid passing things, except that desire. That desire is from God, and that's so right on. Thank you, whoever said that.
And somebody was asking, Helen's asking, will Father be doing any in-person retreats when things start opening up after Corona? Will you be doing any retreats, Father?
Yeah, God willing. If you invite me, I will pray about coming.
That's good. Well, thank you so much. Any last words, John or Father Jeremiah?
I think he could do a retreat on Zoom now.
Yeah.
Hey.
I want to say one thing to that last question, which I loved, which is I have a good friend who for years has been in a sort of posture and position in her life of not believing in God anymore and fighting with God, sometimes sort of passionately arguing with God. And I have sometimes suggested to her, but more often not suggested because I don't want to get in the way, that fighting is kind of like our questioner's longing. And I think the fighting is a really good sign.
Yes.
Complete indifference would worry me a whole lot more than fighting and arguing.
Yep. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Father Jeremiah and John, for sharing with us today on Franciscan spirituality and Father Jeremiah's new book, Amid Passing Things. And thanks so much to everyone who joined us today. Father Jeremiah's book, Amid Passing Things, and several of John Sweeney's books on Franciscan spirituality are available from your local booksellers and, of course, from paracletepress.com. Amid Passing Things is the perfect gift for Father's Day coming up, and most especially for anyone discerning and desiring God's voice. Father Jeremiah's writing is both tender and refreshingly honest. He helps us capture the life that God intends for any of us who fully invest in a relationship with him. It's really one of the best books I've read this year. Free shipping is available this month on orders over $45 on our website, so please consider gifting these books to friends and family. Your generosity will help support Father Jeremiah and his order in their work and ministry, as well as Paraclete Press in our ongoing work in providing free webinars such as this at this time. Well, we hope you enjoyed this talk as much as we did. Our prayers are with all of you for health and safety, and we hope you'll join us for more of these times together with our authors. Our calendar of Zoom events is available on our website, paracletepress.com. Thanks so much, and God bless you all.
Thank you. Bye.
All good.